that I'm going to present is with Patrick Legros from the Free University of Brussels, and I am at ETH, as you just said. And in this presentation, we're going to talk about data sharing between firms, and in particular, in the case of mergers and acquisitions, how data sharing before the mergers can help firms anticipate the value of information synergies. And so broad motivation for this analysis is that recently you've had an increasing number of mergers and acquisitions that were, at least in part, motivated by the desire of a firm to acquire the data sources of a target and merge it with its own data to benefit from information synergies. So for instance, examples are the acquisitions of WhatsApp and Instagram by Facebook, under which Facebook wanted to merge the profiles of WhatsApp and Instagram users with its own. And a bit more than a year ago, there was also the acquisition of Fitbit by Google. And there was a concern that the health-related data collected by Fitbit wearables could be merged with the profiles of Google users, which would benefit Google and allow it to make better recommendations thanks to better data on consumers, but also raising concerns about a potential loss of privacy for consumers. And so because there is this increasing number of mergers motivated by data, an increasing number of data sharing between firms, a number of practices, there is also a literature on these topics. And the first one, this paper by Scaria, Bergmans, Pont, Arnaud, and Lecomte. So here is an assessment of data sharing practices in many different industries in Europe. So data sharing between rival firms or also across industries, sometimes for free, sometimes in exchange of money. And in the case of this market for information, you have also this review by Bergman and Bonatti from 2019. Turning to mergers and acquisition, there is a growing literature on this topic when data is involved. So you have this paper by De Cornière and Taylor that analyzes whether a merger or an acquisition is pro or anti-competitive, depending on the nature of data. This paper by Chen, Shokong, and Matsushima analyze product personalization with consumer data and show that a merger can be welfare enhancing. And in a related paper that I have with David Bounier and Patrick Walbrook, we analyze a merger between data intermediaries and look at how it impacts consumer surplus in product markets. But overall, in these three papers, there is a common view that firms, when they want to engage into a merger, they can perfectly anticipate the outcome. And what we do in the present paper is kind of taking the opposite assumption that it's not necessarily clear for firms what will be the outcome from a merger, in particular when you have data involved. And in the specific case of information synergies, we're going to look at how data sharing between firms before the merger can help them anticipate the extent of these synergies. We also relate to quite older literature on the sale of innovation, in particular with this paper by Antoine Dubus from 2002, from which we borrow the title, and the other one by Daspremont, Bhattacharya, and Gérard Varret. And in these papers, you have this effect, the arrow information paradox that was already discussed yesterday during the keynote speech. That is that if you want to transmit, in their case, an innovation to a prospective buyer, and for instance, you want to do so by to show that the innovation has some quality by describing it, you're actually transferring part of your knowledge of your asset to a prospective buyer or sometimes to a competitor. So that's the arrow information paradox. Yesterday, we had this example with the light bulb of Edison, for instance. And it's actually the same phenomenon that takes place. For instance, if a firm wants to share data with another firm in order to learn the synergistic value of merging two data sets. If I show you my data, if I give you a USB key, for instance, or sometimes something a bit bigger, and so that you can confront it with your own data and learn the synergies of both data sets, actually, I'm giving away part of my competitive advantage. So it can be harmful for me following this arrow information paradox, and this may create a tension on the willingness of firms to share data. So today, what we're going to look at is the following situation. Firms can share data to learn the potential synergies that may exist between different data sets and take better merger decision. But because of this arrow information paradox, sharing data gives away parts of a firm's competitive advantage, and firms may be reluctant to do so. So this is the first question that we answer. Or do firms really want to share data? Also, is data sharing good or bad for consumers? Does it necessarily help firms to take better merger decisions? And from a regulatory perspective, is data sharing good or bad? Does it benefit consumers? Is it good or bad for the industry? Would a regulator allow firms to share data? And does it change the overall merger decisions of an industry? So we wanted to build a theoretical model that would be as simple as possible to capture these different ideas that I just described. And the choice that we made is to focus on Bertrand competition in utility. Actually, we could also consider Corno competition and we would have similar qualitative results. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to take as a narrative the examples of the acquisition of Fitbit by Google. So this is what we focus on here in this beginning of presentation of the model. The situation from which we start is one where you have a firm, so say firm one, which is called Fitbit, that is active in a market. It's actually a monopolist, and it makes profits, U that corresponds to the utility that it can provide to consumers with the products that it has. And part of this utility relies on the fact that Fitbit has acquired information on these consumers and can make them, for instance, better recommendation on how to exercise and so on. So Google is willing to enter this market, but without this specific data about consumer behavior, at least in the short run, Google would make zero profit by entering. So this is firm 2 here, and an alternative and simpler way for Google is to acquire Fitbit by making a take it or leave it offer corresponding to the profits of the firm. So take it or leave it offer corresponding to you. And if there is an acquisition, there is a merger of the data owned by Fitbit with those owned by Google. And this merger can overall yield a positive synergy or a relatively lower one. So for instance, it's possible that the quality of the product after the merger, denoted by the lower bar here, is lower in case of low synergies than the quality that was provided to consumers before the merger. So in the case of Google and Fitbit, this would be, for instance, because after a merger, the data collected by the new firm is directly transferred to Google. And for consumers who are sensitive with respect to their privacy, they may be willing to use the product less because now Google is having access to the data, or even stopping to use the product so that their privacy is not harmed by the new owner. So for this reason, there might be a negative impact of the acquisition on the quality of the product, and this may harm the profit of the overall merged entity. With a probability 1 minus alpha, it's also possible that the merger has a positive impact on the product quality. For instance, because the data merged yields such a high synergy that the recommendation given to consumers dominate a potential privacy loss. And so this positive synergy, the upper bar here, is greater than U. So overall, there is this chance, this risk that the merger yields an inefficiency for the acquirer. So what we consider in this model is an alternative for Google, for firm 2, which consists in acquiring part of Fitbit data before the merger. So we denote by S this portion of the overall datasets of Fitbit. And once Google has received this data, it can play with it, confront it with its own data, and see what is the synergistic value of both datasets. So for instance, what we consider here is that there is a cost to confront these datasets and learn the value of synergies, and that this cost decreases with the amount of data shared. So the idea here is that for me, learning if I have my full data set and only 1 or 2 data points from another one, it's impossible to infer the total synergistic value of 2 full data sets. So this is captured in our model by having this exploration cost here that is equal to infinity when almost no data is being shared. On the contrary, more data being shared makes it simpler for me to learn to understand the synergistic value of the data set. And in the extreme case where all data is being shared, so here, the cost is minimized. So in this figure and what we do in the model, we consider that this cost is equal to 0 when all data is shared, but alternatively, we could consider a positive cost. What matters is that the cost decreases under this idea that I can always do at least as good with more data than with fewer. If half of the data is better for me than having everything, and I have everything, then I can still focus on half of the data. So we could have alternatively considered another cost structure. So for instance, you pay a cost that is fixed, but the probability of learning the synergies increases when more data is being shared. So it would not change our qualitative results. The idea here is that more data shared is good from a perspective of learning the value of synergies. Once firm 2 has paid this cost, CS, and learned the value of synergies, it is able to enter the market and provide a positive utility to consumers. So for instance, if this data that has been shared corresponds for each consumer to a portion of its history, it means that now Google is able to make meaningful recommendations to all consumers, and the relevance of these recommendations increases with the amount of data that's being shared. So we capture this effect in our model by having the utility provided by Google after data is being shared with this term here. So the quality of the product, the value of synergies here, times the amount of data being shared. Firm 1 still provides a utility U to consumers. So within our narrative of privacy concerns, you see that this structure here, where the quality increases with S, also fits with while including a privacy term within the utility of consumers. So for instance, we could decompose this VS as two terms. First, a quality term that only relies on the quality of the product, the recommendations, and so on, which can be high or low, and this determines whether a synergy is high or low, and which is proportional to the amount of data shared. More data shared increases the quality of my product, minus a privacy term, which is also proportional to the amount of data shared. More data shared reduces my utility because my privacy is being harmed. So once data has been shared, now Google can compete with Fitbit. So when synergies are low, Google will always provide a utility that is lower than that provided by Fitbit, and Google will always make zero profits. So this case here. But Fitbit will now face a competitive pressure exerted by Google. So the maximal price that Fitbit can charge will be a bit lower compared to before. So it's U minus V lower bar S. And more data being shared reduces the price that can be charged by Fitbit. When synergies are high, it's now possible that Google provides a better quality product than the one of Fitbit. You see here, if the upper bar, so high synergies times S, so the quality of the product for S data shared when synergies are high, can be greater than U. This happens when S, the amount of data shared, is greater than a bound, which we call the arrow bound, and denoted by A, which is equal to this term here. So S greater than A means that Google makes positive profits under the competitive pressure exerted by Fitbit. So this V upper bar S minus U, and Fitbit will make zero profits. If fewer data than A are being shared, it means that Google will make zero profits, but will still exert a competitive pressure here on Fitbit, and Fitbit will make profits equal to U minus V upper bar S. At this stage, it's still possible for Google to make a take it or leave it offer to acquire Fitbit. So this will only happen when synergies are high. If it would happen when synergies are low, it means that data sharing is not interesting for firms. So it's something that we rule out. And in this case, you see that compared to the initial stage of the game without data sharing, now the profits of Fitbit are much lower. So Google can acquire Fitbit at a much lower price. Actually, we have seen that in case of high synergies, if S is greater than the arrow bound A, Fitbit will make zero profits. So the acquisition could happen at a zero price. And in the other case, when S is lower than the arrow bound, the price of the acquisition is this, which is also lower than what was initially before data sharing. So to summarize what we do, we can look at the timing. Initially, either Google Firm 2 makes the acquisition under imperfect information by remaining uninformed, or it acquires S information from the other firm, potentially against a money transfer TS, because Firm 1 incurs a loss from sharing data. Then Firm 2 invests in the data exploration cost and learns the value of synergies. So we make the assumption throughout the analysis that both firm learns V, as well as the regulator that I'm going to describe a bit below. But actually, in an extension, we show that even when there is a private learning of synergies, the equilibrium of the game doesn't change. We have the same outcome. Now that information is being learned, Firm 2, in case synergies are high, can make a take it or leave it offer to acquire firm 1. And if firm 1 accepts the offers, both firms go to see the regulator, or else firms compete. So there are two opposite effects of information sharing on the profit on the expected payoff of firm 2. On the one hand, acquiring data allows to learn the value of synergies, avoid inefficient mergers, and the more data is being shared, the lower the exploration cost. So more data shared is good following this first positive effect. At the same time, because data being shared will reduce the profits of firm 1, because of this competitive effect of data sharing, it will require a transfer from firm 2, and this transfer increases with the amount of data shared. So you see when S is lower than the arrow bound, the transfer requested by firm 1 to share its data is equal to the expected value of V times S. If S is greater than A, it's equal to this term, and what matters here is that it's also increasing in S. So we can write down the expected payoff of firm 2 when purchasing S as follows. And you see again that you have the negative impact of sharing more data through the competitive effect of data sharing when synergies are low here. And at the same time, the positive effect of data sharing through the reduction of the data exploration cost here. So we have assumed that this data exploration cost is convex, and so we'll have a unique maximum to this solution. And what we show is that when mergers are what we call ex ante efficient, in the sense that the expected value of synergies before the merger are greater than U. So firms would even be ready to merge under imperfect information. Information sharing is always better than merger under imperfect information because you avoid these inefficient synergies. When mergers are what we call ex ante inefficient, so this expected value here is lower than U, it means that firms would not be ready to merge under imperfect information. But on the contrary, it is possible that firms are willing to share data, and if synergies are high, to engage into a mergers when there is data sharing. And the condition for this to occur is that the data exploration cost here is low enough. So this means that we can reach a first set of conclusions. Well, more generally, we have built a model in which firms are ready to share data to learn the value of synergies and avoid inefficient mergers, and they are ready to do so despite the resulting competitive loss of data sharing. What we have shown also is that on the one hand, this data sharing practice is efficient from a merger perspective, but it can also broaden the cases, the situations in which firms are ready to merge. Because as we have seen in the previous slide, when mergers are ex ante inefficient, there are cases under which sharing data allows a merger to go through. So it broadens the possibility for firms to engage into a merger. We also have a result that we find quite interesting and initially counterintuitive. You see, when we look at the expected value of profits in equilibrium here, these expected values decrease when the value of low synergies increase. Because when low synergies increase, it means that the ability of firm 2 to compete when it has received data is greater, and this reduces the expected payoff of firm 1 and increases the transfer that is required to acquire information. So which means that when the large firm, so say Google, has a choice between different targets, and these targets have the same V upper bar but vary with respect to the value of V lower bar, it will preferably choose the one with the lowest V lower bar, because this minimizes the competitive impact of data sharing. But when you look at merger under imperfect information, the expected payoff of firm 2 of Google is equal to this E of V here. And for a given V upper bar, this value decreases when V lower bar decreases. So under imperfect information, Google would be rather willing to take the target for which V lower bar is the highest if it were to merge under imperfect information. So this ability to share data and anticipate the value of synergies actually will change the desire of large firms to choose one target instead of another, and this may change the overall outcome of mergers and acquisition because you have these data sharing practices. Turning to regulatory questions, we have seen that in the last stage of the game, the firms go to see the regulator and ask for the merger to be allowed. So we consider a regulator that balances industry profits and consumer surplus. So what the regulator considers is that here, with a coefficient 1 minus rho, which corresponds to the weight it gives to industry profits, if it allows the merger to go through, there will be a gain for the industry, because before the merger, you have an industry gain corresponding to this term here, which is under competition. And after the merger, you go through a monopoly and you fully benefit from synergies, and the industry profit is equal to this V upper bar. On the other hand, there is also consumer surplus to take into account, which is rated by coefficient rho, and which always decreases after a merger. Because you go from a situation where firms compete and surplus is equal to this term here, minimum of U and V upper bar S. And after the merger, you have a monopoly. And so consumer surplus will be equal to 0. So the regulator will balance these two dimensions. And to capture the idea that at the time firms go to see the regulator to have the merger approved, they may not necessarily know whether the merger will effectively be approved in the end. We consider that this variable rho is actually a random variable that is unknown by firms at the time they ask for the merger. They have there is a distribution of rho, but they do not know exactly what is the value of rho. And a question that we ask is, does the presence of the regulator increase or decrease the willingness of firms to share data? Because this is important, because data sharing is intimately linked with consumer surplus. And an intuition that we had when beginning this analysis was that, well, more data shared increases consumer surplus. So if the surplus is greater, it means that if I want to merge, the reduction of surplus will also be greater. And a regulator that is oriented toward protecting consumers will be reluctant to allow a merger if too much data has been shared. So this will reduce the incentives of firms to share data before the merger. Fewer data shared means that the consumer loss in terms of merger will be smaller. And indeed, it's an effect that we have all the time, actually, and that is unique, the only effect when S is below A. But we have an additional effect when S is greater than A, this arrow bound, and which comes from the fact that, if you remember, the expression of profits of Google in this case, are in case of high synergies, are equal to V upper bar S minus U. And this term increases with S. So there is the idea that if I'm willing to merge, I will make these profits. But if the merger is prevented, more data being shared before the merger will increase my profits in case of competition with high synergies. So I'm kind of willing to acquire more before the merger because there is a chance that after I won't be able to acquire anything at all. And actually, so both effects go in opposite directions, and we can characterize an environment under which the second effect, this positive effect of regulation on the willingness of firms to share data, will dominate the first one. Which means that in terms of consumer surplus, the regulator can have a strong positive impact on surplus. On the one hand, if more data is being shared, it means that competition, under competition, consumer surplus will be greater. On the other hand, because the regulator will prevent some mergers to go through, it means that the scope of values of mergers for which competition will occur will be also wider. Now there will be high synergies mergers that will be prevented in order to protect consumer surplus. At the same time, we will show in a couple of slides that the presence of the regulator can even discourage firms from sharing data, because there is this chance that the merger is prevented, so they'd rather merge under imperfect information. If firms are willing to merge under imperfect information, the regulator is always allowing them to do so, because there is no loss of consumer surplus. Before the merger, there is a monopoly, Fitbit. After the merger, there is another monopoly, Google, and in both cases, consumer surplus is equal to 0. And industry profits in expectation are greater, or at least it's necessary for firms to ask for the merger that industry profits are greater in expectations. Overall, we show that a regulator is always willing to have firms share information if it values consumer surplus sufficiently, because more data shared will increase consumer surplus. So this allows us to reach our second set of conclusion. We show that the presence of the regulator can have opposite effects on the desire of firms to share information, and this impact will depend on the overall data exploration cost. We also have kind of surprising effect, I would say, that is that a regulator that is fully biased toward consumers, so a rho is very close to 1, willing to protect consumer surplus at any cost, will actually block all mergers, because it will always find that the loss of surplus dominates the potential gains for the industry. Which means that in this case, firms will be willing to merge under imperfect information, and consumer surplus will always be equal to 0. On the contrary, a regulator that is more balanced on its view between protecting consumer surplus on the one hand and protecting industry profits on the other will give more incentive for firms to share data, because they know that they still have a chance to have the merger allowed after data has been shared. And this will give chances for consumer surplus to be positive in case synergies are low or in case the merger is prevented. Meaning that a regulator that is fully biased towards consumers will actually yield a lower consumer surplus than a regulator that is willing to protect, at least to some extent, industry profits. So we view this result not as a crazy theoretical results that you should protect the industry if you want to protect consumers, but rather in the spirit of, for instance, patent rights, under which you're willing to grant a monopoly power to firms to give them incentives to invest in innovation in the first place. So here we find that we have kind of a similar effect. If you want firms to engage into an action that is positive for consumers, you need to give them, in a sense, guarantee that this will be also profitable for them. So we also wanted to focus on a concrete decision that had been taken by competition authorities in this recent case of Google Fitbit and Facebook WhatsApp, under which the merger was allowed, but firms were not allowed to merge their data sets. Which means that in our framework, after the merger, you have only one firm, so no competition anymore, but you cannot benefit from the overall synergies. So it means that, for instance, in the case of Google having acquired S information, the profits of the industry, if S is greater than A, will be equal to V upper bar times S. And so the question that we want to answer here is, how does this data siloing decision impact the willingness of firms to share data? And a simple way to model it is to have a probability gamma under which, if the merger is accepted, silos are requested. And with the probability 1 minus gamma, you have a full merger under which you have merger between firms and merger of data sets. And what we show is that we have kind of similar effects as the impact of a regulator on the willingness of firms to share data. Because now, with data silos, you can see it here, the profits after the merger with data silos, so no merging of data sets, are equal in case of high synergies and S greater than A to this term here. So more data being shared before increases this term. In this idea that if I'm not sure I will be able to receive the full data set afterward, I have interest to take as much data as possible before, which of course is balanced by the competitive loss for firm one and reduces the incentives to acquire the full data sets. You also have kind of a typical effect, which is similar to what we have before. If S is lower than A, now the expected payoff of the industry when sharing data will be lower when there is a chance that siloing is requested. And this lower expected payoff will reduce the incentives of firms to invest in innovation acquisition. So again, you have a positive and negative impact of this merger remedy on the desire of firms to share data, and in the end, also on consumer surplus. So then we go through a number of extensions. I'm just going to pass very quickly. We look at bilateral data sharing instead of information purchasing, under which Google would be ready to give parts of its data to Fitbit in exchange of the other data. We also consider a positive entry cost. Fitbit is not only a platform, but it also sells these wearable devices. So there is a cost to produce them. What happens when you have this cost? So you also have this, what I talked about before, asymmetric information about the value of synergy. So Google learns it privately. We show that this induces the same equilibrium as with public learning. And finally, Nash bargaining on the final value of the merger instead of an acquisition. Overall, these extensions, we find the same effect as what we have with a simplest baseline model. To give you an idea, sometimes what we find is that the competitive impact of data sharing is even softer by this extension. So for instance, if there is a positive entry cost for Google, it means that data sharing is not a real threat for Fitbit as long as the profits of Google are below this fixed entry cost. So this will allow Fitbit to share more data with Google and even allow firms to learn more frequently the positive value of Synergies. So to conclude my talk, I think what we have here is kind of a typical case where theoretical analysis is not completely useless, because we're in a case where these data sharing practices are very hardly observable between firms. Long-term effects, for instance, on merger decision, industry efficiency, and so on are very hard to capture. But here with this simple model, we show that these data sharing practices may take place. At the same time, we can anticipate the impact that it would have on firms' decision to merge for consumers. And we also highlight the necessity for a competition authority to adapt their practices and, for instance, their desire to allow for a merger to these data sharing practices in order to fully achieve their goal, for instance, in the example that I gave, to fully protect consumers. So this concludes my discussion. I would be happy to attend the discussion.